My name is Dominique Hooper, and if there's one thing I've always known, it's that my dad, Herschel Rousseau, has been my safe place. He's the person I've run to for as long as I can remember, the one who always made me feel like I mattered. I don't even know when things started to shift between us. Maybe it was always there, lingering under the surface. Or maybe it's something that grew slowly, in the quiet moments we spent together when no one else was around. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. Big windows, a white picket fence, the whole picture. But inside, it felt cold. My mum, Caroline, was always more interested in appearances than emotions. She liked order and rules. She liked things clean and quiet. I never felt like I fit into the world she wanted to create. I always felt like I took up too much space. My dad was different. He was warm, loud when he laughed, and never cared if I made a mess. He let me be myself in ways my mom never did. I'd sit in his workshop for hours, watching him fix things and listening to his stories. He made me feel seen. And when my mom's focus shifted more and more to her career, it only brought me and my dad closer. By the time I was a teenager, it felt like my dad was the only one who really knew me. He never missed my dance recitals, never forgot the things I cared about. I'd sit with him on the couch late at night, and we'd talk about everything, my dreams, my fears, the things I didn't tell anyone else. He listened like it mattered, and I think that's why I started leaning on him more and more. It wasn't just emotional. I liked how it felt to be close to him. I liked the way his arm felt around me when we watched TV, how he'd pull me in when I started to drift off. It never felt wrong, at least not at first. It felt safe, familiar. But things changed when I turned 18. My mum was barely around anymore, travelling for work and leaving us alone for days at a time. My dad and I started spending even more time together. Nights on the couch turned into mornings drinking coffee in our pajamas. We got so used to each other's company that I started to forget where the lines were supposed to be. I'd catch myself noticing things about him, his hands, the way his voice sounded when he laughed, and sometimes I'd notice the way he looked at me too. It wasn't like before. It lingered. It made my stomach flip in ways I didn't understand. Or maybe I did, but I didn't want to admit it. The first time things crossed a line, it didn't feel planned. It wasn't some big, dramatic moment. We were sitting on the couch like always. I was leaning into him, my head resting on his chest. And then he looked down at me, and I looked up at him, and something shifted. Neither of us pulled away. I remember his hand brushing through my hair, slow and careful, and how my breath caught when his fingers moved to my cheek. I didn't stop him when he kissed me. I kissed him back. And just like that, everything changed. My dad, Herschel, was always the steady one, the kind of man who could make you feel safe just by being in the room. I used to think it was just because he was my dad. But looking back, maybe it was more than that. Maybe it was the way he never looked at me like I was too much, even when my mum did. Maybe it was how he always made time for me, even when no one else did. My mum, Caroline, was different. She had sharp edges, like someone who cared more about how things looked than how they felt. She'd fuss about dishes left in the sink, but wouldn't notice if I cried myself to sleep. She always seemed busy, too busy to listen, too busy to care. And honestly, I stopped trying after a while. I think my dad noticed. He was the one who'd sit on the edge of my bed and talk to me when I was upset. He'd make jokes to get me to smile or pull me into his arms until I stopped crying. He never told me to toughen up or act my age. He just let me be myself. When I got older, things didn't change. If anything, we got closer. Mum was gone more often. Work trips, conferences, things that mattered more than being home. That left me and my dad alone most nights. And honestly, I liked it. I liked the way it felt like it was just the two of us, like we didn't need anyone else. We had our routines. Late-night movies, ice cream straight out of the carton, and talks that lasted until we both fell asleep on the couch. Sometimes, I'd wake up with his arms still around me, his breathing slow and steady. I told myself it was normal, even when I started to notice how warm his body felt against mine, even when I started to wonder what it would feel like if he didn't let go. There were moments, small ones, that I should have questioned, like the way he brushed my hair back from my face and let his fingers linger, or the way his hand rested on my thigh when we sat too close on the couch. He never pulled away, and neither did I. I started dressing differently around him. Softer clothes, thinner fabrics. I told myself it was just because I wanted to be comfortable, but deep down I knew better. I liked the way his eyes followed me when I moved. I liked the way his voice softened when he talked to me. Maybe that's why I didn't stop him when things started to change. Maybe that's why it felt so easy to lean into him when the world outside felt so far away. And maybe that's why I don't regret it. If you're still here, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who'd be drawn to this story, and subscribe for more. I promise there's so much more to tell. It happened on a night that felt like any other. My mum was out of town again, some business trip that seemed more important than coming home. It was just me and my dad, sitting on the couch, sharing a blanket like we'd done 100 times before. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching. We were just there, together, in that quiet space that always felt like ours. I don't even know what started it. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when I laughed, like I was the only thing in the world that mattered. Or maybe it was the way I leaned into him, letting my head rest against his chest, my fingers brushing over his arm without even thinking about it. But at some point the air shifted. It was heavier, warmer, like we were both aware of something neither of us wanted to say out loud. His hand moved first. It slid down my arm, slow and deliberate, and when I looked up at him, his eyes didn't move away. I should have pulled back, I should have said something. But instead, I let him keep going. I let him trace the outline of my face, his fingertips brushing over my lips like he was memorizing the shape of them. When he kissed me, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable, like we'd been moving toward this moment for a long time and finally stopped pretending we weren't. His lips were soft, careful at first, but then hungrier. And I matched him. I wanted it just as much. I don't know how long it lasted. Time felt different, stretched and blurred until I couldn't tell if it had been seconds or hours. All I remember is the heat of his hands, the weight of his body as he pressed closer, and the way I couldn't bring myself to stop. Afterward, we didn't speak. We just sat there, breathing hard, the silence between us louder than anything we'd said before. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know where to start. What do you even say after something like that? I waited for him to look at me, to say it was a mistake or that we'd crossed a line we couldn't come back from. But he didn't. He just touched my face again, gentler this time, and kissed my forehead. And for a moment I let myself believe that maybe it wasn't as bad as it felt. But the guilt came later. It crept in when I was alone in my room, replaying everything in my head. I kept telling myself it wasn't what it looked like. It wasn't wrong because it wasn't planned. It just happened. People cross lines all the time, right? I told myself we weren't hurting anyone. Mum was never there anyway, and it's not like she ever made him feel loved. He deserved more than what she gave him. And maybe, just maybe, I was the one who could give it to him. That's how I slept that night, convincing myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. I knew it was only the beginning. The days after that night felt like walking through a dream. Everything looked the same house, the same routines, but nothing felt the same. Every time I looked at my dad, I felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't guilt, not at first. It was excitement, like we'd unlocked some hidden part of each other that no one else could touch. We didn't talk about what happened, not right away. But we didn't avoid it either. It was there, in the way his hand brushed against mine when he passed me in the hallway, in the way his eyes lingered just a second too long when we sat across from each other at breakfast. Every glance, every touch felt like a secret we were both too afraid to name, but too hungry to stop. It started small, Whispers exchanged when my mum wasn't looking. A quick squeeze of my hand before he left for work. Text messages that felt too warm to be innocent. "Miss you already," he'd write after leaving the house. "Can't stop thinking about you." And I'd stare at my phone, heart pounding, my fingers trembling as I typed back. Then there were the nights. Mom's business trips became the perfect excuse for us to let go of whatever restraint we had left. We'd sit together on the couch, but this time, I'd curl into him differently. My legs tangled with his, my head on his chest, his fingers lazily drawing circles on my back. And when the tension got too heavy, he'd take my face in his hands and kiss me like he couldn't help himself. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate, like every touch mattered. We found ways to be alone even when my mum was home. Late-night walks that lasted longer than they should have. Quick trips to the store where we'd hold hands in the car, letting go just before we stepped outside. We stopped being careful. And maybe that's what made it more thrilling. The constant risk, the constant hunger. My mum started noticing the changes. She wasn't the most observant, but even she could feel the shift. She'd catch me staring at my dad and narrow her eyes like she was trying to put the pieces together. She'd ask questions she never asked before. "Where were you two? Why didn't you answer your phone?" Her voice always sharp, always suspicious. It didn't help that my dad started pulling away from her completely. He stopped pretending. He'd barely speak to her, wouldn't even look at her during dinner. And when they fought, he never tried to fix it. He'd just leave the room and find me. Always me. And I let him. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but it didn't feel that way when we were alone. It felt like we were the only ones who understood each other, like we were saving each other from something. I told myself he wasn't happy with her, that I wasn't stealing him. I was giving him what he'd been missing. Love, attention, affection. But the tension in the house grew thicker. My mom's eyes followed me everywhere, her questions more pointed. "Why are you always with him? Why do you act like you're the woman of this house?" She'd spit the words at me like venom, and every time my dad would step in to defend me, and every time he did, it only made things worse. There were nights I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. I knew what we were doing couldn't last. I knew it was dangerous, that someone would eventually figure it out, but I didn't care. Or maybe I cared too much. I didn't want to let it go. I told myself it wasn't hurting anyone. My mom barely cared about him anyway. She was gone more than she was home, and even when she was here, she acted like we were strangers. And I made him happy. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he touched me. So how could something that felt so good be so bad? Still, the guilt lingered. It hit me in quiet moments, like when my mom kissed him goodbye before another trip. I hated her for touching him, hated her for thinking he was still hers. But then I'd hate myself too, for feeling jealous, for wanting something I was never supposed to want. Sometimes I'd think about what would happen if we got caught, what people would say, what it would do to us. But then he'd pull me into his arms and tell me everything was fine. And I'd believe him. I wanted to believe him. I told myself we weren't breaking anything that wasn't already broken. And maybe that was true. But the more we fell into each other, the harder it became to see a way out. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me, there's so much more to uncover. I didn't see it coming. Maybe I should have. Maybe I was too wrapped up in the secret world my dad and I had built to notice the cracks forming around us. But when it all came crashing down, it wasn't slow. It was brutal. Like a glass shattering all at once, leaving pieces too sharp to ever fit back together. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. My mom came home early, hours earlier than either of us expected. I was in the living room with my dad, curled up against him like I always was. His hand was on my thigh, and I didn't move it. I didn't even think to. It felt too natural by then, too normal. I didn't hear the door open. I didn't hear her footsteps, but I heard her gasp, sharp, loud. Like the sound you make when something inside you snaps, and when I turned around and saw her face, I knew there was no way to explain it. Her eyes locked on my dad's hand, then on me, then back to him. She didn't scream, not right away. She just stood there, frozen, like her brain couldn't process what her eyes were seeing. What? What is this? She finally whispered. Her voice broke halfway through the question, and that's what made it real. That's when my stomach dropped. My dad tried to speak first. Caroline, it's not. Don't, she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the air. Don't you dare. I wanted to say something to defend him, to defend us, but the words wouldn't come out. And then it was too late. She was already grabbing her keys, already slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Everything unraveled after that. My mum didn't come home that night, or the next. When she finally did, it wasn't to talk. It was to pack a suitcase. My dad tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. She wouldn't even look at him. But she looked at me. And the way she looked at me hurt more than anything she could have said. Like I wasn't her daughter anymore. Like I was someone she didn't recognize. Someone she hated. You're disgusting, she said. Her voice was cold, flat. Both of you. I wanted to tell her she didn't understand, that it wasn't like she thought. But what was the point? She wouldn't have believed me even if I tried. And maybe she was right not to. She left that night. She didn't just leave the house, she left me. She didn't call, didn't text, didn't even check to see if I was okay. And I hated her for that almost as much as I hated myself. My dad tried to hold everything together, but it was like trying to hold on to sand. It slipped through his fingers no matter how tight he gripped it. And the more things fell apart, the more we clung to each other. I think we both knew it was wrong by then, but we were too far gone to stop. My mum didn't keep it quiet. She told people, friends, neighbours, anyone who would listen. And it didn't take long before the whispers started. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. People stared. People talked. At the grocery store, at the gas station, even walking down the street. Did you hear about the Russo girl? Sick. What kind of father does that? What kind of daughter? I stopped leaving the house. I stopped answering my phone. Friends I'd known for years suddenly stopped calling, stopped texting. Even the ones who wanted to talk only did it to pry, like my life had turned into some scandalous story for them to gossip about. My dad didn't handle it much better. He lost his job. His boss didn't say it was because of the rumours, but we both knew it was. People didn't want him around their families. They didn't trust him. And the worst part? He didn't even fight it. He just let it happen, like some part of him believed he deserved it. We were pariahs, shut out, shut down, and all we had left was each other. I don't know how to explain what it's like to lose everything, to have people look at you like you're less than human, like you're broken in ways they can't even imagine. But that's what it felt like. And maybe we were broken, but we weren't sorry. If you've made it this far, let me know what you think in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories. Trust me, this one's not over yet. I didn't leave the house for weeks after everything came out. Every time I looked out the window, it felt like someone was watching, waiting for me to crumble. Maybe I already had. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know if I was a victim or a villain or maybe both. At first, I avoided the truth. I buried myself in the comfort of my dad's presence, pretending we could still exist in our own little world. But the silence in the house was louder than ever, and no amount of whispered reassurances from him could drown it out. I started to question everything, every decision, every touch, every word we'd said to each other. The shame hit me in waves. Some mornings I woke up feeling like I'd been swallowed whole. Other days I felt angry at my mom for abandoning me, angry at the world for judging me, angry at myself for not knowing how to make it stop. I hated that part of me still wanted him, that I still reached for him when I felt lost. Therapy was my mom's idea. She didn't say it out of love, though. It felt more like a punishment. "You need help," she said, her voice cold and final. And maybe she was right. I went because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know how to fix myself. My therapist asked questions I didn't want to answer. How did it start? Did I feel pressured? Did I feel loved? Did I feel safe? And the hardest question of all, do I regret it? I didn't know how to answer that one. I still don't. My mom and I barely spoke at first. Every conversation turned into an argument or ended with her crying and walking out. She wanted me to hate him, to see him as some monster who'd ruined my life. But I couldn't. He wasn't a monster to me. He was my dad. And that made it harder to let go. Eventually, my mom gave up trying to fix me. She focused on herself instead, moved into a new apartment and started acting like I didn't exist. I don't know if it hurt her too much to look at me or if she just didn't care anymore. Either way, it left me feeling more alone than ever. My dad tried to keep me close, but even he started pulling away. The guilt was too heavy for both of us. Some nights he'd sit across the room instead of next to me. Some mornings he'd leave before I woke up. And I think we both knew it was only a matter of time before one of us walked away for good. We stopped talking about the future, stopped pretending we could rebuild what we'd destroyed. And when he finally packed a bag and left, he didn't say goodbye. He just left a note on the kitchen table that said, "I'm sorry." I should have felt relief, but all I felt was empty. I don't know where to go from here. Part of me wants to believe I can start over, that I can find a way to live a normal life again. But another part of me isn't sure I deserve that. I think about what people see when they look at me now. Do they see a victim, a predator, or something in between? Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier if we'd never been caught, if we could have kept living in that fantasy where no one could judge us. But I know that's not true. I know we were always going to end up here broken and lost. I still dream about him sometimes. I wake up with the memory of his touch, and for a second it feels real. And then it's gone, and I'm alone again. And maybe that's what I deserve. Or maybe it's not. I don't know. I wish I had answers. I wish I knew how to make sense of everything, but I don't. All I know is that I'm still here, trying to figure out what comes next. Maybe you see this story and think I'm disgusting. Or maybe you understand more than you want to admit. Either way, I want to hear what you think. Tell me, what would you do if your world fell apart like mine did? How would you move forward? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. And